thank you very much. It's my privilege to moderate this panel, and I just wanted to ask members of the audience to write down questions. We have staff folks wandering through the audience to take up your questions so that we can put them to our distinguished panelists. Their introductions have already been made, and the information is in the material before you. So in order to make the most of this time, let's just start out with some questions. And so as you're writing yours down and we're collecting them, I'll just take the liberty of starting off with one, and that is, if we look at China's macroeconomic system today, it is of course far more developed than it was 30 years ago. And how do you envision that macroeconomy moving forward in the next 30 years? And I think particularly the question of how the relationship between policies of macroeconomic control and market forces interact with each other.
非常高兴能回答您这个问题。那么，在过去的30多年中，准确的说呢，从1978年到2012年，这是中国改革开放的35年。在这35年中，中国经济年平均增长9.8%，成功的创造了中国经济奇迹。那么，这就是有您刚才提到的。 那么30年前和今天有了很大的差距，但是要准确的预测未来30年中国会发生什么，那将是一个十分困难的问题。那么大体上我们可以给出呢，在未来的30年中，中国经济增长速度来说，可能会从过去的接近10%，下降到未来10年7%左右。 再下降到4%到5%这么一个水平。即便是到了2040年左右，中国经济增长只有了4%到5%，但它在全球来说，仍然是一种很高的经济增长。我们认为到那个时候，中国的人均 GDP 应当达到高收入国家的平均水平。 注意，我说的是人均 GDP。中国一定是世界上最大的消费市场，中国经济对全球的影响将会进一步扩大。您刚刚还提到了关于政府的宏观调控和市场的关系。这个去年呢召开了党的18大，明确提出，在处理政府和市场的关系上。 应当更加倚重于市场，也就是市场在未来中国经济发展过程当中将会扮演更加重要的角色。那么政府直接对经济的干预将会越来越少。我想，一个完善的社会主义市场经济体制，这应当是我们对3中全会以后中国经济体制改革，我们认为呢，它最核心的目标。 就应当是建立一个比较完善的社会主义市场经济体制，在这个体制当中，市场应该发挥更大的作用。谢谢。
Well, Pat, turning to you, can I just ask you to share your thoughts on what reform means today in today's China? And I would just preface that by saying that the topic of reform is not without its controversy. And the question of how much reform has been completed and whether what has to go forward is actually reform or perfection and those kinds of issues that you're quite familiar with. So can you share your thoughts about it? And what does reform mean today?
Well, sure, thanks, Pitman. Actually, I've lived through all the reform in China because I've been here a long time. And I think this time is somewhat different. And I would start by saying, what is the definition of reform? To me, because I'm a commercial person, it means you adjust your business model. And that's essentially what the government of China is doing next month, or to start the first steps. Because they have no choice but to restructure their model, and the main goals are going to be to improve the investment environment, increase efficiency, productivity, and address some of the systemic imbalances and inequities that are in the current model. I'm going to use a couple words that are well known to my panel colleague at the BRC, which is that China's moving from high-speed growth, which is called the scale dividend, into something different, which is an institutional dividend or a productivity dividend. And if you've ever seen the World Bank's 2030 report, which was done in cooperation with the DRC, there's some very fine work in there that explains that in incredible detail. And make no mistake, the leaders of China know what that document. Now, from a commercial point of view, I would describe the last 30 years of reform generically as being very input-driven with the strong hand of the government guiding investment. But as we go forward, it's going to be moving towards a more efficient model, and the government has to determine how it's going to balance their role versus the market forces. And as we come to next month, when we see the first signs of what the reforms would actually be, we will have an idea of where things are going. But unlike in a Western model, when you say reform, that's something you expect to happen immediately. In China, reform means they'll put out the policy as they're legal, but they're conceptual, and they'll constantly be adjusted to see what works in the next couple of years ahead. And I'll talk about it a bit later, but we're in for a lot of volatility and uncertainty in the commercial sector in the next 24 months.
Well, thank you. Yuan Lasher, I think what I would just ask is, what are your views on the role of the private sector? I mean, we just heard a discussion about the changes from the relationship between the public and the private sector and reporting to the market and so on. How do you think the private sector is doing?
应该来说，过去中国经济之所以能够保持一种持续高速增长的态势，也正是我们不断的调整改革公有部门，从而为适应经济的发展创造出了越来越大的空间，这才有了过去中国经济发展所取得的成就。但是从目前的情况来看，公有部门或者说国有企业，我认为呢，还存在着巨大的改革的空间。如果我们在三中全会以后，能够对国有经济的布局做更大的战略性的调整，把国有经济、国有企业更多的集中于一些重要的领域和关键的行业，把其他的一些领域，尤其是竞争性的领域，把它让给适应部门。那么这样的话，适应部门将会获得进一步的发展空间，整个中国经济运行的效果将会进一步的提高。当然了，这些年的这个，比如说国进民退，这也是市场说的比较多的一个话题。那么，我个人认为呢，针对这种情况，三中全会以后，应当把国有经济布局的进一步的调整，作为它改革的一个重要内容。大量的国有资本、国有企业介入竞争性领域的后果，它是给不同所有制的企业创造了一种不公平的竞争环境，它是不利于适应部门的发展，也不利于整体效率提高。我认为这应当是三中协会以后的一个改革的一个重点。
Well, Pat, I think you talked about reform and how it means different things now than it might have in the past. And so one question related to that, of course, is how do companies present their business proposals and plans in light of those differences? And also in a more general sense of, your sense of the main challenges and opportunities of this new wave of reform.
Okay. Well, since the reform package has not been announced, it would be difficult to say exactly what companies should do. But my first recommendation is when they do come out, study them very carefully and discuss it internally both with your foreign and domestic staff to understand what it means to the company at a strategic level. One of the great challenges as we go to the next phase of reform, which the professor and I were discussing before, we call it development rather than reform in many ways because it's always evolving. One of the first challenges specifically for companies is what I call the China fatigue factor. And what that is the administrative licensing environment here is so complex on multiple levels. People are really getting quite tired of having to deal with it. And one aspect they would like to change is a significant reduction in the numbers of documents, licenses, and papers that have to be filed in order to do even everyday business. The other challenges are, and that's a structural one, and this is more in the government space, how do you persuade vested interests, and that would include state-owned enterprises, to agree to open up the marketplace to greater competition? And that's one area I think in the next 24 months we're going to see a bit of tension. But it's an evolving process. Nothing happens in China overnight. You start from one point and you keep negotiating the whole way through.
Just to add something on this, I think that one of the challenges is not only the constellation of commercial interests and even bureaucratic interests, but there's a critical path problem, which is where if a regulatory environment, a policy environment, has been geared toward a certain set of objectives and outcomes, it's very hard to shift that battleship in midstream to achieve a new set of outcomes. And it's not only an issue of willingness or interest or what have you, it's sometimes just bureaucratically, institutionally extremely difficult to do that.
Well, that's exactly right, and I would be interested in hearing Professor Yu's take on it as well. For a foreign company, if you look at, let's say, countries in the region, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, you don't interact with the government very much on a day-to-day basis. You probably do it online. And if you really need something, then you go see them. So the question is, to what degree will the new administration here reduce the day-to-day role of administrative intervention in a private business, for example? And if you talk to private business people here, they spend an awful lot of time chasing paperwork, and that time could be much more productively used doing business. Maybe the professor could share his thoughts about that.
I think that one of the issues that comes up when you think about regulatory practice, not just in China, but in many other countries, is how much of it is aimed at concrete social benefits and how much of it is just habit. And a lot of times, administrative regulatory practice is a function of sort of habit. And so there's a lot of registration activity, supervisory activity, and so on that actually gets kind of disconnected from the public goods element of it. So one of the questions that I think is worth thinking about in terms of where reform is going is, what is and what will continue to be the primary objectives of the regulatory system? What are they aiming to do when they ask for those forms to be filled out, when they ask for those appearances? I'm interested in anybody's thoughts on that.
我们从这一点上来说，其实上今年呢，这个新一届国务院政府呢，对于改革，它实际上已经采取了一些这个市场已经反应好的一些做法。你比如这个上海自贸区的叫负面清单制度，就它列出呢什么是你不让干的，只要能不在这个清单里头的其他事情，你都是可以做的。这表明中国政府已经在着手处理这个你刚刚讲到的这个政府这个企业与政府打交道花的时间太多的问题。同时呢，还比如呢，这个改革现有的审批制度，叫谨慎放权、放宽准入等等这些改革，它实际上已经都开始启动，那么而且取得了这个很好的这个社会反响。我相信3周全会以后，这样的改革还会更多。
Well, related to that, of course, is the we see major policy shift over the last actually 8 to 10 years, which is the shifting from export-led growth to domestic demand growth. And one of the questions is, of course, how is that going? But another related question, consistent with what we've been saying already, is how does the government management regulatory process change in the context of that? And we see that this morning, earlier today, when we talk about the foreign investment into Canada, and how Canada regulates investment varies depending upon whether it's domestic or foreign investment, and that's true of many, many countries. So the question is, how does the regulatory system, the policy system, reflect these changes from export-led growth to domestic demand?
确实处在一个重大的这么一个转折的这么一个关头。对于中国经济所需要的转变来说，那么我们可以把它概括以下几个方面。那么第一点呢，是您刚才提到的，就是过去的增长，它更多的依靠的是出口的增长、投资的增长的拉动。那么未来呢，我们需要把它转变到立足于消费扩张的轨道上，这是我们面临的第一个重大的转变。我们面临的第二个重大转变呢，就是呢，过去中国经济的增长主要是靠工业制造业的快速扩张，我们在很短的时间之内，工业化的任务接近完成。那么未来呢，中国经济增长的动力将主要转变到服务业的发展上，这也是为什么设立上海自贸区它的原因所在。就是服务业领域的对外开放，服务业领域全方位的与国际接轨，向包括加拿大在内的这些国家学习，从而促进中国的服务业的改革与发展。那么第三个方面转变，我们可以把它概括为中国原有的竞争优势，伴随着土地、原材料、能源、劳动力、资金成本的大幅度上涨，还有人民币汇率的大幅度升值，我们原有的低成本、低价格的竞争优势正在逐步的丧失。那么我们需要在高附加值、高科技含量产品的生产上，通过创新，从而形成新的竞争优势。所以总体上，我们认为呢，中国经济目前处在一个十分关键的这么一个时期。如果增长动力的转换、竞争优势的转换是成功的，那么我们预计在未来10年中，中国经济可以保持7%左右的经济增长，从而在未来10年中，中国有可能成为全球第1大经济体。中国也可以从现在上中等收入国家迈入高收入社会，也可以实现党的18大报告提出的全面进程小康社会的目标。所以，从整个经济体制改革，或者说是整个政府管理宏观经济的角度来讲，就是应当为实现这些转变，创造更好的环境和条件，来推动中国经济的平稳转换。我们认为，这是目前之所以说它是个十分关键的事情，到这里。
Thank you. One of the things that we've talked about this morning and throughout this day is how do we translate, if you will, macro policy into things that are actually useful for companies down the ground level. There's lots of discussion about what the macro policy is, shifting from export-led to domestic demand, and other elements of shifting between sectors, industrial, service, high-tech, so on. But I think what a lot of SMEs and Canadian businesses are interested in is how does that actually play out at the operational level? So Pat, have you kind of thought about that, about how we kind of distill those broad policy directions into something that is going to mean, be concrete for an operational business?
Okay, that's a complicated question, and it's one when I was at the U.S. China Business Council, I ran into very frequently. And my experience is that companies don't like to pay for people to interpret these things, policy advisors. So it's sometimes the language can become very arcane and difficult to digest. So what you really need to do is what I was mentioning before: pull together your Chinese staff, because they know this is quite well. Sit down, have a team meeting, figure out what the strategic implications are for the company, do a SWOT chart, and see where you can find some opportunities in the new environment going on. And you can take the macro policy guidance and identify the areas where you can be very supportive to government organizations who are trying to implement change. And I've done that throughout my whole career here in China. Don't go against the grain. Stand up for what it is you want to do, but be very persistent and try to achieve it in cooperation with government bodies, and it usually works.
So if I just follow up on that a little bit, and if we, I mentioned this idea of honoring Deng Xiaoping's guidance to never stop reforming, but I wonder, with that in sort of in mind, do you have some thoughts about these sectors of sort of tax policy, securities, IPR, and some of the other kind of hot button issues, and how those are being affected by the reform discussions, even though we haven't seen the documents yet?
Okay, actually I have a list of the 10 most relevant business issues for companies today, at least on the American side, and you can look them up at the U.S.-China Business Council's website. But generally speaking, greater competition, vastly increased costs, and administrative licensing issues. These are the 3 top problems for companies. And I would go back to costs as number 1. China's becoming very expensive, as the professor said. It's low-cost manufacturing is not really a solution anymore. They have to shift to higher value products, and China's certainly capable of doing that, provided policymakers reset the playing field so both foreign and Chinese companies can benefit from the regulation. And one way to do it in the context of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, with the exception of opening up financial markets within that zone, I would argue that everything else should be subject to national treatment, and you don't need to put it in a zone, because frankly, no one wants to move to Waigaoqiao as an industrial area.
Good point. This whole national treatment thing is something probably on the scope of today, but it's a very interesting question of how what actual specific effects that has on business decisions within the economy where national treatment is being implemented, and what it means in the context of particularly different sectors and different ownership structures of firms.
Right. Very, very quickly, because Professor Yu should give us his thoughts. And this is not a new thought, but if a Chinese company goes to North America and opens a business, once they fill out the paper, pay the fee, unless there's some national security issue, they are considered a local company. The reverse is not true here, and hopefully that's something that's going to shift next month.
Yeah. You have a thought on the national treatment question and the treatment of foreign business in China and local business, and how that reflects this, and the invest abroad groups, and how that kind of reciprocity question and how that relates to market-based regulation. Share your thoughts.
实际上，我们外资企业在中国既有不公平的国民待遇，同时也在部分领域也超国民待遇的问题。我认为这2种情况都是存在的。那么对于很多中国的民营企业来说，那么他们认为呢，我们在有些领域对外资企业都是开放的，但是对民营企业，并不容许进。那么反过来，因为你刚才说到的，那么他没有取得平等的国民待遇。针对这样的情况，我认为呢，这个改革一个核心问题，就是要为不同所有制的企业能够创造一个公平竞争的环境。我们把它叫做不同所有制的企业能够平等的使用生产要素，能够公平的来进入他自己愿意进入的任何的行业。同时我还想跟你说，我们最近呢完成了有3000多家企业的调查，就你们究竟希望需要从政府的得到什么？希望政府帮你们解决什么问题？反映最多的是，那么希望政府的宏观经济政策能是稳定的，不要一会儿踩油门，一会儿踩刹车，让这个企业呢没办法对未来市场给出一个准确的预测和判断。希望能够宏观经济政策能够保持相对稳定，这样以便于他们对未来做出预期。那么再反映了很多的问题呢，比如资金的高成本的问题，这也是今天的中国经济运营当中面临的一个很突出的问题。一方面呢，我们的流动性非常宽裕，货币供应量的增长远远高于GDP的名义增长，但另一方面呢，对于大多数企业来说，会面临这个资金成本很高的问题，利率不断上升的问题。还有一个反映很多的，就是 准入公平，这也就涉及到你刚才提到的问题。民营企业他们也认为呢，他们也没有获得平等的国民待遇，所以我们认为呢，无论是国有企业、民营企业还是外资企业，都应当是同等对待。政府应该创造这样的环境和条件。
Thank you. And speaking of things like predicting and how difficult that can be and so on, there's a lot of discussion about China's growth rates. Some we've heard discussions that they dip and they go up and so on, and we know, of course, that growth rates are very closely tied to issues of social well-being and employment levels and so on. So what do you think? Do you think these are going to continue, or what any observations you might have going forward? Both of you.
中国经济高速增长已经超过了30年，世界上没有新的。从世界上所有国家的情况来看，没有哪一个国家能够永远保持经济的高速增长。我们认为呢，中国有例外，中国经济增长速度的下降是不可避免的。那么，如果说过去的30多年，我们保持了接近10%的平均增长，那么我们认为未来10年，我们有可能保持7%左右的增长。也就是说，我们预计未来10年，中国经济增长速度将会下降到10%左右，7%左右。去年中国经济增长7.7%，今年上半年中国经济增长7.6%。我们认为呢，我们目前正处在从10%的高速增长阶段，向7%左右的中速增长阶段转换的进程中。这是目前我们对中国经济的基本判断。那么由此，我们可以看出未来它会逐步的走向7%左右这么一个新的增长平台上。但即便是这样，由于中国经济总量大幅度提升，今年中国经济总量将会超过9万亿美元。因此，尽管它的速度是下降的，但它对整个全球经济所产生的拉动作用仍然是很大的。我们认为这一点并没有发生改变。
Okay, well, that's a very interesting point. I too agree that 7% is probably the right number, within the range plus or minus of 1. For the next 2 years, going back to what I was saying about some volatility and uncertainty, right now we have a lot of temporary imbalances in the economy, many of which have to do with massive overcapacity in certain sectors. And as we go forward, although the new leadership didn't tell me personally, I'm very sure that one thing they're going to address immediately is consolidating these industries and streamlining them so that they become more efficient, and then you get the productivity dividend that the DRC is famous for discussing. I think if 7% growth in China is really like 4% growth in North America. If China went below 5, then I'd get worried. But even at 5.5 or 6, it's okay. We've already just been through a year and a half of, I think it was 3.5 actually, much lower than the official numbers, but everything came out okay.
Before I move on, I want to make sure that we've got any questions collected. Have we collected any questions from folks? Yeah, please. Yeah, if people have questions, please write them down and raise your hand, and some of our good friends at CCBC will come around and collect them. So, we're great minds think alike. This is exactly what I was going to get to, which is how can foreign businesses design their projects to support local economic and social development? So this is switching gears a little bit toward a question about corporate social responsibility and the contribution of foreign business to local development. It actually reflects some of the conclusions in a recent report from the Asia Pacific Foundation that deals with social and economic rights as a kind of human rights impact of investment and so on. And again, getting down to the concrete, how do businesses go about designing and planning projects in order to have that local impact on social and economic development? Part of this point Pat was making of help them achieve their own goals. So that would. Do you want to start that?
Okay, so going back to what I said earlier, when the new reform package comes out, look at it very carefully. See what the policy direction is going to be. If you can't figure it out, hire experts who can guide you through it. And but start with your own staff, because usually they're pretty good at these things. Once that's announced and you see the direction of change and understanding it will not be immediate, it will be an evolutionary process. It's not hard to figure out where your company's goals and the government goals align, especially at a local level, which is where you really get in trouble. And it's no different than doing a gold mine in Canada. You have to do a lot of work at the local level, talk to the local community, see what their worries are, and address those concerns, and then do some public good works. And usually that's very helpful. There are some industries where you can't do it so easily, because you don't have a project necessarily going to be financially driven. And then you have to go identify your own ways to help the community. But it's not hard to do. And there's a very well-established body of experience here in China through many different organizations that could help guide you.
我想提醒的是呢，中国是一个发展极不平衡的。我们不仅存在明显的东部、中部、西部地区的差异，而且也存在巨大的城乡发展不平衡。那么在这样的情况之下，企业如何给当地的帮政府做事情，或者说尽社会责任，我想主要取决于你这个企业落户到哪个什么地方。落户到东部地方、东部地区、中部地区、西部地区，可能政府面临的这个紧迫的问题，需要得到帮助的领域是存在一些差异的，所以这并没有一定之规。主要是根据你落户的那个地方，那个地方政府面临的这个挑战，需要得到帮助的领域是什么，这样才能决定你企业究竟如何来进行社会责任。
So we've had a few questions here on some of the broader policy questions, and I'll just read one that says, currently China is turning left in politics and turning right in the economy. Please ask, is this correct? And do you think it is workable? So maybe you agree or disagree. I don't know about turning left and turning right on one or the other, but I think it would be an interesting.
I don't agree either. If you think of the history of new Chinese administrations, they always have to get tough in the beginning. So they establish themselves and build political support so they can implement the changes they want to do going forward. And I think maybe the reason Professor Yu is telling you he doesn't agree is reforms that are coming now are at least 6 years overdue, and everybody from top to bottom knows it. The fight is over. What are they going to be, and how fast will they happen? But the direction forward is developing the country to make it a better place for both foreign companies and domestic companies and the citizens of China.
I think the cautionary note that you made earlier really is also a useful response to this, which is that you have to wait and see. Things take time to develop. So even in just 1 year or less than a year since December, we have to be careful about reaching conclusions about directions, right? So I think that's part of the cautionary. Well, here's a more concrete question, and it touches back on the corporate social responsibility and the local development elements that we've been chatting about already. And this has to do with the aging population in China, that demographic condition. How does reform as a policy, and then how do businesses as practitioners take that reality into account and respond to it?
这个问题确实是摆在我们面前一个重大的挑战。2012年，中国60岁及以上人口是1.94亿，那比加拿大人口还多。那么60岁及以上人口占总人口的比重达到了14.3%，而且还处在一个快速上升的过程。 那么针对这个问题呢，实际上我们现在讨论的大概有以下几个政策问题。第一个呢是呢，中国的计划生育政策是否需要做相应的改变？这个长期一对夫妇只生一个孩子的后果，是今天老龄化步伐快速到来的一个状态。那么是否需要改变？那么第二点就是呢，中国的退休政策是否需要尽快的延长退休年龄？我们现在在很多地方，那么男同志60岁退休，女同志55岁退休。现在医疗条件越来越好，人的寿命越来越长，那这个退休政策是否需要改变？第三个呢，就是呢，中国过去它是以居家养老为主，中国人的传统叫养儿防老在家里养老。那么未来呢，我们可能需要盖更多的养老院、敬老院，从而从居家养老为主转向社会养老为主。这是关于中国人口老龄化相关的3个政策方面的这个讨论。我也相信呢，这个呢，很快可能这个政府呢就会对这些问题给出一个解决的答案。人口老龄化对企业来说，实际上它会带来一些新的机会，跟老龄这个相关的服务各种各样的需求就会产生，因为人口规模很大。我相信呢，这对加拿大的企业来说，可能是意味着有新的机会。
说得很好。I really like that. Very good.
So one of the issues related, of course, to that, and that has to do with labor relations and labor market conditions in China. And one of the things we've certainly seen over the last decade in particular, but 2 decades, is significant changes in the nature of the labor force in China, greater training, expense factors, and so on. So how, looking forward, how would a foreign business be thinking about managing its labor challenges, its labor costs, training workers, worker benefits, and productivity, and that sort of thing? So maybe Pat can start that.
Actually, human resources is the 3rd largest issue for American companies, and a lot of that has to do with talent acquisition and retention. A headhunter told me recently, for your white-collar managers, the average time they spend in a foreign company is around 18 months. That's 6 months to learn the job, 6 months to do the job, and 6 months to get the next job. And so there's people chase more money, as you should. It's not only foreign companies that are trying to pinch everyone else's staff. There's very large demand from Chinese companies that want to go abroad, where they need funding for staff. The wages issue, I think it's a trap that's very hard to get out of, because right now the costs for staff are very high. If you go farther west, staff are cheaper, but the best and the brightest usually have already gone to the coastal cities to seeking better employment, and because it's bright lights, big city, and as you move farther west, even though your relative costs are cheaper, your logistics cost goes up significantly. So it's kind of a push, and you're much farther away from your industrial cluster, which makes it very complex. Going back to what I said about China fatigue, I can say unequivocally, when I was in the US and Southeast Asia last month, every single person I talked to said they're looking at China, they're also looking at everywhere else in the region, because they don't want to only be in China. They want to diversify their risk and their talent. And the government agrees.
伴随着中国人口结构的变化和老龄化带来的直接问题就是，2022年中国劳动力人口总量出现首次下降，这样由此带来的后果就是劳动力的供求关系从过去的供给大于需求，转变为目前的供不应求。当然，它也存在结构性的问题。那么一方面，人工荒、招工难和 和低端劳动力成本大幅上涨。那么另一方面呢，它也存在大学生就业难的问题。那么我们在中国这个实地调研的过程当中，我们发现呢，很多企业针对劳动力成本上涨，他们采取的方法是叫机器化就是提高设备的自动化水平，来减少劳动力。那么我认为这可能对于很多企业来说，可能都是有意义的。当然，怎么稳定劳动力队伍，怎么不断提高劳动力的素质，通过培训等方式，我认为这个非常重要。
So, sorry, in this period, which even higher on China's international champions, they're going to robotic manufacturing for certain products because they can't get the staff and what they do is too expensive on a cost basis.
So I don't know if we have time for one more question, or was that the question that we had time for? I think we were being told that the time is not our turn. So on that basis, I'd like you to join me in thanking Pat Powers and Professor Yu Bin for their very instructive